From the Gulf States Newsroom, this is the Gulf States Gumbo, your weekly serving of stories from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. I'm sports and cultural reporter Joseph King, chopping it up this week. Now, you may be familiar with the idea of disenfranchisement. It refers to someone's ability or inability to vote, and it describes thousands of people across the Gulf South. And it's a word that community engagement reporter Elise Gregg is going to break down for us. Hey, Elise.
Hi, Joseph. Yes, that's a word to describe a lot of folks I've talked to and about over the last couple of months. Like you mentioned, someone who has been disenfranchised is someone who can't vote. And we've actually got an earlier Gumbo episode where you can hear from some of those folks in Mississippi and get all the details. If y'all have time, I'd recommend checking that out first. It's called Restoring Voting Rights in the Gulf South, which is pretty easy to remember.
Yeah, that is easy to remember. That episode on Louisiana and Mississippi, right? But for today's piece on Alabama, how's things looking here?
Yeah, so in Alabama, people can lose their voting rights if they have certain felony convictions. And it's important to note, it differs between each state. Mississippi has 23 felony convictions that'll disenfranchise you. Any felony conviction that results in a, quote, order of imprisonment in Louisiana leads to losing the right to vote. And in Alabama, disenfranchisement is based on this very long list of crimes of, quote, moral turpitude.
Moral turpitude. Okay, what does that mean?
So moral turpitude means, like, in the most textbook kind of way, dishonest or wicked behavior, and it's kind of a vague term. So in 2017, Governor Kay Ivey signed a law to define exactly what laws fall under that category. So it's not applied in this really broad way, but it's still a pretty long list. And the process for getting the right to vote back differs by state, too, which you'll hear about in just a second. The bottom line to remember is that Mississippi's disenfranchisement right now defaults to being for life and is probably the most complex of the three states.
Well, how complicated is it?
Well, here's one of my sources, Darius in Alabama. This is what he said when I described the restoration process to him.
It seems like it's more designed not to restore than it is to be a vehicle to restore.
That's interesting, especially for me. I have family members that are felons in Alabama who want to vote.
Yeah, no, definitely. He also told me how he had to deal with Alabama's system firsthand and the obstacles it presented in getting his voting rights back. And honestly, his story was pretty eye-opening for me.
Well, let's hear from him, and we'll be back afterwards, so stay tuned.
Do they have to pay the restitution?
That's correct.
That's Mississippi Representative Darrell Porter Jr. answering questions about a block of bills to restore voting rights to people who've lost them after being convicted of a felony.
By a vote of 94 yeas, 10 nays, bills pass.
This year, legislators received over 60 individual suffrage bills. Last year, they had over 70. Not a single one made it through final passage in 2025.
None, because they got caught up, again, casualties of war, got caught up in the fighting between both the House and the Senate as it relates to the budget.
Even in less combative circumstances, though, these individual suffrage bills rarely pass. One estimate puts the average at 0 to 6 a year. This year, it was actually higher than that, with about a dozen bills becoming law. Mississippi isn't the only state in the Gulf South that takes away people's right to vote, but it is the only one that requires people to find a legislator to sponsor a bill to restore their rights, which then has to pass both the House and the Senate by a 2/3 vote, and then has to be signed by the governor.
This process in which a person has to go through to have their rights to vote restored is too tedious, it's too cumbersome, too many politics get in the way.
Porter and his colleagues are pushing to get people their rights back automatically once they finish their sentences. But not all lawmakers are on board, so they have to compromise. That includes modeling measures after laws in other Gulf states. For example, including a waiting period during parole, like Louisiana. One measure this year was modeled after Alabama. HB 1661 would have established a panel to review restoration applications.
No, I'm not in favor of a board being put in place because it's just another level of bureaucracy.
And that bill would have afforded this proposed panel a lot more discretion than Alabama's Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. On paper, Alabama's process seems fairly straightforward. If you've committed a disenfranchising felony, then you have to meet 4 requirements to submit a Certificate of Eligibility to Register to Vote, or CERV, application. You have to be free of any pending felony charges, have paid all your fines and fees, have completed your full sentence, including probation and parole, and not have committed certain crimes that require a pardon instead of a CERV. If you check all those boxes, you send the Bureau that application. They then have to respond within 44 days. So hypothetically, it should be pretty simple.
That is so not true. The journey was very difficult. A lot of obstacles in the journey.
That's Darius, who requested that we not use his last name for privacy reasons. He's an Alabama resident who's worked in the corporate world for over a decade now. The crime that disenfranchised him was trafficking in marijuana. That was in 2006, and it was over 15 years before he could vote again. He started with applying to the Bureau.
And from there, it turned into just this thing in regards to getting over this hurdle of paying off these fines and fees, in my case, which was roughly about $64,000.
That's not something he could pay, so the Bureau denied his request for restoration.
But I just played my case in regards to it through writing and also when I was in front of the board. From there, this was in 2022, they initially restored my voting rights based on that argument.
The state does allow the Bureau to review applications for fine and fee forgiveness, but they have a lot more discretion in rejecting or accepting those applications. Birmingham resident Stephanie Hicks was also disenfranchised after a bank fraud conviction in 2016. But in her case, the crime wasn't actually disenfranchising.
Mine should have never been removed. They were, because I was going to try to vote and I saw that they were removed.
In 2018, someone finally pointed out to her that she should still be able to vote.
They said, go online and reapply and see. And about 48 hours to 72 hours, my rights were restored.
Hicks currently does advocacy work to help others get their voting rights restored and says that education is critical within the current system to prevent issues like what happened to her and to help people who truly have been disenfranchised to get back to a normal life.
You tell them everything they're going to have to do on the inside. Now you need to tell them everything they have to do on the outside.
Until people know what their rights are and how to get them back, she believes these issues will persist.
You're listening to the Gulf States Gumbo. I'm Joseph King. That was community engagement reporter Elise Gregg reporting on voting restoration in Alabama and Mississippi. Now, Elise, it seems like it's just hard for everyone.
Yeah, you've got this really tricky system set up in Mississippi compared to some really high hurdles in Alabama when it comes to meeting what are otherwise straightforward requirements.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Darius, the guy in Alabama, wasn't a fan of either Alabama or Mississippi's processes, right?
Yeah, that's right. And obviously, as someone who couldn't vote because of the requirements in Alabama, he's not in favor of the system at home. But he actually didn't know what Mississippi's process entailed, so I broke it down for him.
At least with the state of Alabama, and I'm not promoting the state of Alabama, there is a process that's in place that gets you in front of the parole board.
And actually, I walked through Mississippi's restoration process with everyone I spoke to in Alabama, and they all had some very similar reactions, like Stephanie Hicks, who's a Birmingham resident.
That is unreal. It is like we are being punished all over again.
And another person I spoke to, Dev Wakely, who is a worker policy advocate with advocacy group Alabama Arise.
I will say that Mississippi does appear from that to have an even higher hurdle than Alabama, which is unfortunate.
It sounds like everyone is a little surprised, too.
Yeah, for sure. Like, everybody's got issues in the Gulf South, but Mississippi's definitely got this really high bar that's a little unusual.
And you mentioned that lawmakers in Mississippi are trying to change things but have to use Louisiana and Alabama as inspiration?
Yeah, and I talk a little bit more about this in the last episode on suffrage, but basically, Mississippi legislators who are in favor of a new system just want fully automatic restoration, like Representative Darrell Porter Jr., who you heard from earlier, and his colleague, Representative Zakiya Summers.
We have always taken the position that once a person has completed their sentence, they should be automatically restored.
Okay, they want their voting rights to be automatically restored, right? But they have to compromise.
Yeah, they've got to compromise to get those lawmakers, mostly Republicans, who aren't keen on a new system, on board with the idea of automatic restoration. And the preferred compromise among Mississippi's Democratic lawmakers is a waiting period modeled after Louisiana's 5-year waiting period during parole.
And why is that? I mean, I know we just heard from people saying Alabama isn't ideal, but it seems that it will be a little better than Mississippi.
Yeah, and actually the representative who proposed that Alabama-inspired measure was a Republican.
Okay, that sounds like a layup in getting out the current system. making it a little easier and not dependent on a bunch of politicians.
Maybe, but here's what Summers had to say about that.
Actually, that was kind of my same line of thinking, that it would take the politics out of the process. But what we've also seen with boards and panels in the state is that they generally have individuals that are appointed by the leadership, and the leadership still has a lot of influence on how that panel operates and how they're structured.
Reading through this proposed panel bill in Mississippi, HB 1661, some other things about it caught my eye as well.
Okay, like what?
Well, its sponsor, Representative Noah Sanford, gave this panel a little more discretion than Alabama's. It would have included opening an investigation into applicants during the restoration process, alerting sheriffs and district attorneys in the counties where an applicant's conviction occurred, and considering letters both for and against a restoration application. I asked the folks in Alabama what they thought of all those proposals, though, like Wakely.
I've never heard of anybody writing a letter in opposition to someone regaining the right to vote. That would be unheard of here.
And Hicks.
I got to have all these factors taken care of, and you have to notify all these people. That's a pardon process. That's no longer a voting rights restoration process.
Okay, so I guess they're not really fans.
No, not really.
Is there anything that everyone can agree on, though? Like something to help folks, even with all this disagreement and frustration with all the different systems, and what should be done differently?
Yeah, actually, and this is kind of where things came full circle. Education.
Yeah, like Hicks said. People get told what they need to do inside, and they need to know what to do once they get out, too.
Yeah, exactly. And Mississippi is not making progress in that regard either. A couple of bills that would have expanded restoration education failed this year, along with automatic restoration measures. But Alabama is making progress on that front. State Senator Linda Coleman Madison has been a proponent for expanded restoration practices and education for years now.
As we discover these little things that prevent people or barriers, one of those things was the fact that people didn't know how to apply.
She sponsored a measure, SB 24, that would require the Bureau to post procedures and an application form for requesting restoration of voting rights. And the Bureau would have to post on its website the Alabama institutional serial number of parolees and probationers whose applications have been approved.
So they can go on this site, find their number, and if their number is listed, they know that they are eligible to vote.
And she's been proposing similar measures for a couple of years now, with earlier bills, being postponed or dying on the calendar.
So what happened this year?
This year it actually passed. It was signed by Governor Kay Ivey on April 15th.
Community engagement reporter Elise Gregg, thank you so much for joining us and really unpacking this issue and how it's playing out across the region. Really great work here.
Oh, well, thank you, Joseph.
This week's show is cooked up by the Gulf States Newsroom team. Our theme music is by DJ Supreme. Special thanks to our partner stations WBHM, Mississippi Public Broadcasting, WWNO, and WRKF. You can find us in your podcast feeds every Friday. Look us up and be sure to subscribe. Again, I'm your host, Joseph King. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to steer your rule.